This is the project that almost didn't happen. Welcome! I'm sharing my start to finish process of making my second resin horse complete with all my struggles. There is a happy ending, so grab a favorite snack or beverage and get comfy. This is going to be an adventure. I began the sculpture much as I do with any of my original works, starting with a wire and aluminum foil base. This project began at the end of October 2020, which was 2 months after completing and casting resin copies of my first original horse sculpture, Ray the Norwegian Fjord. The clay I used this time was actually left over from molding Ray. I had purchased original Sculpey in terracotta color and decided I didn't like it as a mold making clay, so I had a decent amount of clay left over. One of my biggest sculpting struggles is just getting faster at completing work, and I also found that one of my biggest struggles with epoxy putty in particular was the rush to use it all up before it cured. As someone who sculpts during free time, I found that I was often mixing up putty, sculpting a little bit, and then getting called away and finding it was unworkable and wasted when I got back. My bestie felt that polymer clay might be the perfect solution, so I started with the leftover clay from Ray's mold. Also, I wanted to quickly mention, sometimes when I start something very new to me and that's also really challenging, I find I need to shut off the camera so I can focus. This means for this horse I only have a little video of the sculpting stage and instead a lot of photos that I took at the end of every sculpting session. Don't worry though, the bulk of this video is, well, video. Just bear with me for the sculpting chapter, please. Something I really wanted to experiment with was subtractive sculpting methods, and if you've watched my previous videos, you know I love drilling and sanding in particular. This works best with a firm surface, so I needed to test out baking different layers of polymer clay as I went along, which also meant overcoming my childhood struggle of burning all my polymer clay sculptures. I started this mare before I started sculpting the rain frog, and a lot of the reason why that frog baked so well is because I made all of my mistakes on this mare. One of the things I had to learn was to use an oven with a stable temperature, so that meant no more toaster ovens, as a sudden high fluctuation of my toaster oven is what burnt this mare. I also learned how to make a tent from aluminum foil to help protect against heat fluctuations. Cracking was my other huge struggle. I found this was largely from letting my model set out unbaked for too long. Sanding and filling with liquid polymer clay helped though. Delamination and bubbling was another issue, and this was because I was not pressing new layers of clay down firmly enough to squish out any air. Air that was trapped expanded in the oven, creating bubbles. Actually, the head was the most difficult thing about this horse sculpting project. I had to reshape, extend, and remove it so many times to get the proportions right and to help get it set on the neck right. The breed I was striving for was a Campolina Marchador, a gaited breed of Brazil. The Campolina has strong Spanish lines and its own unique look, especially in the head. It's a breed I really love, so it was important to me to do whatever it took to get that head looking just right. Original Sculpey is not as durable as the epoxy putties I'm used to working with, like Aves or Milliput. It's a little rubbery and a little brittle, which can make drastic alterations like this an interesting challenge. In other projects I hope to share later, I found that Super Sculpey is a lot better about this. It's not as brittle and seems overall stronger. One of the advantages of polymer clay is that I found using simply my fingers and smooth metal tools was all I needed to smooth out the clay, whereas with epoxy putty I'd need water to get the same result. No water was used in the making of this horse. I really wanted to see how polymer clay looked in all stages of a sculpture, so I also created the hair in details with original Sculpey. I have to admit it's a little different, but I found it was still possible to get a nice look using the same techniques I've used with epoxy putty. It just takes a little extra patience. Texture is something else that's important to me, and I saw a neat leathery texture developing with this clay, so I really tried to push that while still maintaining a nice balance of overall smoothness. I'm on a quest to create texture that is interesting, yet still appropriate for a smooth-coated animal. The final details like the wrinkles and veining I painted on with liquid Sculpey. I also sanded those to make sure it all felt in scale and not too crisp. And then I primed to get an overall matte surface and double check that I was indeed happy with everything. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with the results. Now, I'm not a mold making and resin casting expert. Rather, I'm a self-taught student of the resin arts. As such, this video is an entertainment-focused vlog about my own personal adventures to teach myself this process. It's like a fun, over-the-shoulder look at my process to learn. So I'm sorry this is not a tutorial or guide, though I have linked some resources that have been helping me if you're curious. I made the mold box from styrofoam and sealed it with clear packing tape. I built half the box first and started the clay process for easier access. I'm using a sulfur-free clay that I previously tested with a small batch of my silicone to make sure they both got along. My last horse took 5 hours non-stop for the clay stage, and I felt so rushed and frustrated during that process. This time, I spent 8.5 hours over 7 days, really taking my time to plan my seam lines and try to think about potential issues while they were easy to fix now. I like to use gravity to my advantage and design the mold so that the resin pours in from the hooves and belly, flowing down towards the head. This forces resin down into the fine details like the ears and out the tiny toothpick vents. This means the horse is upside down, and if you're a seasoned mold maker, you may have already spotted the grave error with my mold shape. The bulk of the weight rests on a small side of the mold, almost like an upside down pyramid. This comes back to bite me. Unaware of what was coming, I blissfully cleaned my clay with Gamsol, smoothing out the surface and ensuring I had beautiful seam lines. And hey, to be fair, those seam lines were pretty gorgeous if I may say so myself. Like, look at those. I'm really proud of those. I continued adding vents with the ends of toothpicks and placing them where bubbles might get trapped as the resin flowed in. I made my pour spouts from Milliput epoxy putty, and I placed veggie oil between the spouts and my horse so that the Milliput wouldn't secure itself to my horse. I pressed the end of a pen into the clay to form keys. These will appear as bumps and indents in the silicone that will help lock the mold shut. Then I tape the mold box and seal off the edges of the clay with more noodles of clay, making sure nothing could leak. For the rest of this video, I'm wearing a vapor mask. Mold release will help ensure the silicone won't stick. And speaking of the silicone, this is my first time trying dragon skin. Like before, it comes in 2 parts that require thorough and careful mixing. It had been a year since my last mold making project, so my mixing technique was rusty. Poor mixing can trap a lot of air bubbles. To help reduce bubbles, I did vacuum degas this, after reading the manual and watching safety videos, of course. My pouring technique was also rusty, and unfortunately, I added bubbles right back into the silicone as a result. I don't know what I was thinking grabbing that spatula. Look at all those bubbles. Unfortunately, there were a few large bubbles a few millimeters away from the model. I was worried that they were close enough and large enough that if they collapsed within a pressure pot, they could result as bumps on the resin cast. So I decided to put the mold box back together and re-pour this side of the mold. I also chopped up the first pour so I could recycle it. By the way, adding silicone chunks before you pour the next silicone is a guaranteed way to trap even bigger bubbles. So blissful. Speaking of blissful, did you know you can easily clean up mixing cups after the silicone has cured? It's like an ASMR session. My husband walked in as I was doing this and asked if this was the real reason I got into mold making. No. Moment of truth. Given that the air pockets trapped this time were mostly along the edges of the mold, I wasn't sure if these would actually impact my resin casts. After much indecision, I chose the mold the next side. Mold release is very important here as silicone will stick to silicone and fuse perfectly. By now, I was much more practiced at pouring a tall, thin stream of silicone and letting it flow up gently. I also mixed smaller batches and poured in stages so I can control my mixing method better. And now, the ultimate moment of truth. Oops, her poor ear. Oh well, at least that's easy to repair. Remember I was really indecisive about the air pockets in that first slide? Well, I felt safer pouring it one more time. And finally, I was done. I cleaned up the clay residue and made a cradle for the next stage, resin casting. I start off with a quick tidy of my workspace to get previous art supplies out of my way, and I find it's a great ritual to help my brain switch focus to a different task. Newsprint will make cleaning up the resin supplies easier. Then I grab steel wire from the hardware store and start making leg supports. It's not always necessary, but as I cast larger work on solid poured resins, this can relieve some of the stress on the thin legs, and I love how solid it makes them feel. Curling the ends inside the hoops helps keep the wires from slipping out of the legs and into the body cavity. Then I set those aside so I could go spray that good old mold release again. I also powdered a very thin coat of baby powder, which further acts like a mold release and gives a very nice matte texture to the resin, which makes priming and painting easier as matte surfaces offer more tooth for that stuff to stick. With leg wires reinstated, I close up the mold and begin strapping the cradle to it. The cradle helps keep everything snugly shut and provides consistent pressure. Get that right, and in theory, I'll have very little flashing on the cast. While still wearing that vapor mask and ventilating my space as well as I can, I crack open my resin bottles and begin mixing and pouring. I'm also wearing gloves to protect my skin just in case the resin splatters. This is Smoothcast 310 resin, which has a pot life of about 15 minutes. In other words, this means I have about 15 minutes to mix, pour, and get this whole contraption into my pressure pot before it begins to cure. Turns out it only takes me 5 minutes. After reading the manual for safe operation and watching videos, I let my first cast sit in my pressure pot for the whole demold time, which for Smoothcast 310 was about 4 hours. After seeing how much resin had leaked onto my table, I was worried for the demold. Oh gosh. Remember I said that pyramid structure would bite me? Well, gravity and the weight made it so that the tiny bottom part of the mold couldn't stay shut snug, so the resin leaked halfway out the horse. Unfortunate, because it would have been such a perfect cast otherwise. I had to pause this project for a day to weigh my options. Making a new mold was the obvious solution, but I had already doubled my budget, and the thought of tripling my budget to start over was very, very unappealing, which left the other options of abandon this project or find a way to force the mold I already had to work. I chose to locate the leak exactly and see where I needed extra pressure help. Just in case, I covered the bottom of the pressure pot to avoid another messy leak. Thank you. I'll take that. I made sure I had extra rubber bands at the bottom of the mold and also ran tape along the seam lines just in case there was still some leaking. And waited another 4 hours. At least this time there's only a tiny drip, so that's promising. And now, oh thank goodness. I'm so relieved. Not only did it work this time, it's a fairly clean cast. The flashing was paper thin and scraped off easily, and there were only a few bubbles in the elbow and heels that I can easily fill with Milliput. I can't find any pinholes, so the pressure pot did its job. I proceeded to cast until I ran out of resin, each time refining the pressure points from the rubber bands. I had a few other issues that you'll see in a moment, however I managed to get 4 good casts for this project. Well, 4.5 if you count that scary first attempt. So another issue I ran into was not pouring enough resin to reach the tops of the hooves and tails. I found making push molds from Kneadatite and rebuilding with Milliput was a quick way to get repaired parts that matched the original sculpture because it was, well, from the original sculpture. Easy peasy. My goal for the resin casting stage of this project was to create cleaner results for my last horse Ray, particularly along the seam lines. I did some initial drilling of the seams to remove the flashing from both the Ray cast and the Campolina casts. You can still see the seams on Ray, yet the seams on the Campolina are pretty much invisible now. Next time, I hope to create casts this clean without any need to drill or sand. I'm also really happy with how well the increased detail of the second sculpture translated into the resin. This Campolina is so full of life. And here we go, time to cue the results. Introducing Eruina. This mare was worth the wait. I am so happy to have a finished project featuring one of my favorite breeds, and I really love how much of an improvement the sculpture is over my first horse, Ray, who I still love too. I also hope you enjoy this very candid look at the creative process, complete with its joys and frustrations. Maybe it brought some comfort to my fellow artists wondering what role success, perfection, and mistakes should play in their own processes, or perhaps it simply entertained. And with that, I'll let you get back to your day unless you want to stick around for the Easter eggs. Bye!